because it makes me look stupid. Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and good day. I'm very, very happy today to have someone who I've wanted to talk to for a long time, the Franklin.
Hello.
In my opinion, one of the best Australian YouTubers. And I'm going to do what I usually do, and I'm going to play a tune. And today it's going to be an appropriate one.
Once a jolly swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree. And he sang as he watched and waited till his billy was, "You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda, you'll come a waltzing Matilda with me." And he sang as he watched and waited till his billy was, "You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me." Down came a jumbuck to ring at the billabong. Up jumped the swagman and grabbed him in glee. And he sang as he stole that jumbuck in his tucker bag, "You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda, you'll come a waltzing Matilda with me." And he sang as he stole that jumbuck in his tucker bag, "You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me." Once a jolly swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree. And he sang as he watched and waited till his billy was, "You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda, you'll come a waltzing Matilda with me." And he sang as he watched and waited till his billy was, "You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me." Down came a jumbuck to ring at the billabong. Up jumped the swagman and grabbed him in glee. And he sang as he stole that jumbuck in his tucker bag, "You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda, you'll come a waltzing Matilda with me." And he sang as he stole that jumbuck in his tucker bag, "You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me."
And there we go. Obviously, Waltzing Matilda by Australian diggers in World War II. And traditionally, I think the Franklin will probably agree with me, that was one of the big-time bases of Australian self-identity.
Yes, it was, although it's interesting to note there was a bit of a division in Australia. You see with the Ned Kelly myth as well.
Mm-hmm.
Some people sort of side more or less with Ned Kelly. Some people see him as a kind of folk hero. Some people see him as a scoundrel. And even that song, Waltzing Matilda, I think it's interesting that Australians often self-identify as basically a a sheep thief, if you like, who evade, and the end of the song is him evading the police by jumping in a lake, essentially, so they can't catch him. And then there's the sort of his ghost lives on. It says a lot about our national psyche.
Well, I don't know. Look, I'm an Englishman, obviously, so I'm a pommy bastard. Excuse my language. And although I've never once been called that in Australia, although I am 200 pounds and 6'2", but I've never once been called that in Australia. I've been called a pom once or twice, but not particularly in a bad way. But when I first arrived in Australia in 2000, because I become involved with an Australian woman in South Africa, and when I first arrived here, Australia seemed to be still fairly traditional. You know, there was a lot of stuff about mateship. There was a lot of stuff about a fair go. And in some respects, like I come from a working class family. Like I was born in the middle of London, on the south side of Tower Bridge, and my family were all soldiers, but they were all cannon fodder soldiers. You know, they weren't generals or colonels or anything of that nature. And I was a soldier myself, but when I first arrived in Australia, although I was not particularly that myself, I kind of got the impression it was almost like a working class paradise in some respects. I don't know what you think about that, Franklin, but that was just me as an outsider. That was what I thought in 2000.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even by then it had changed a lot. I think it was even more like that back in the early 90s and the 80s, and it had probably changed significantly even by the time you arrived. But really after 2000, Australia became very aspirational, and there was a lot of cultural cringe that all of a sudden people had money to travel, and there was this big push for foreign cuisine and all of this kind of stuff, and being cosmopolitan. And there was also a huge uptick in, absolute numbers of immigrants, but also the composition of immigrants changed. So it was fairly common prior to 2000 for people to have migrated from the British Isles. But I think probably even by around the time you arrived, British people wouldn't have been the major group of immigrants by that point, I think. So there were a lot of changes that were occurring, and there was very much a sort of what we call cultural cringe towards the sort of old Australia and that sort of working class Australian lifestyle, and the sort of simple aspiration of you'll just have a very ordinary house, and maybe you'll have a boat or something like that, and you'll go fishing, you'll go away interstate for a vacation and go fishing or something like that. That all changed quite dramatically in the 2000s. Also, Australia had the money because along with immigration, there was a huge property bubble that still hasn't really burst. And Australia made money hand over fist, selling anything it could dig up to China. So Australia ended up avoiding the GFC, for instance, because of that. So there was all this money all of a sudden, and so people sort of looked on their upbringings and their parents' way of doing things and all of that kind of stuff like it was some sort of dark age. Yeah, that really changed, I think, around the time that you came.
Yeah, I remember like my late Australian woman she had a master's degree in nursing. Like she was very, very qualified in that kind of area. She went to Newcastle University in New South Wales to get her master's degree. And she was always a girl who would call a spade a shovel. in the Australian sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like she was very well educated. She was extremely intelligent. But like if something was bullshit, she would say it was bullshit. Like I remember once I had to stop her hitting 2 Japanese tourists in the Australian War Memorial in Canberra because they were laughing at all these photographs of their diggers, you know.
Yeah.
And I literally had to stop her hitting them. To me, she was like a real Australian girl, you know. Very intelligent woman, but like wouldn't stand for no bullshit. And to me, that was when I first arrived in Australia. That was what I loved about it. I just thought, oh God, these guys really are as advertised, you know. They yeah, I don't think it's true anymore. Absolutely not. Well, that's wrong. I think it probably is true in some rural areas and in the outback, but I don't think it's true in big cities, and certainly not in the shitholes like Melbourne. But I don't know what you think. You're a real Australian, so you can say what you think about that.
Yeah, that's a strange one. I mean, I don't think I'm even remotely stereotypically Australian. And had a very strange upbringing too. My parents moved around a lot, including to live overseas. And then I was raised in Australia, but because of my parents and they had a very unique kind of situation. Because of all of that, we didn't participate in a lot of the standard cultural practices in Australia. And then once I left university, I ended up spending more than half of my adult life until I came back to Australia. And I think even now, I still haven't sort of crossed back over to where more than 50% of my adult life has been spent overseas. So I don't know, I have a real kind of love-hate relationship with a lot of these things. And I see a lot of things here that frustrate me too, because I think Australia's always called the lucky country, and that was originally used as a pejorative to say that basically we don't really have to think or work very hard for what we have, and we've been very lucky in that sense. And I think a lot of that's coming to a close, and I think Australians are going to have to make some hard adjustments. I don't know to what extent anything will ever go back to how it was, because I think a lot of the sort of the Australian psyche, if you like, is very much a settler frontier spirit, and Australia is no longer a frontier. So that's, you know, that there's always that pattern. It happened in other parts of the world too. You get these guys who carve civilization out of the wilderness, and then you get sort of more blue-pilled people who follow, and then eventually they tame everything completely, and they have no need for those guys anymore. And so everything changes, the culture changes, and so on. And I think that's what's happened in Australia. It's no longer a frontier.
The only place I have got a real kind of a bit of a frontier vibe from, I wouldn't say a real frontier vibe, but kind of like the echoes of it, if you like, was in the Northern Territory.
Right.
I certainly thought in the Northern Territory there was still a little bit of an echo of that old frontier vibe.
Right. Yeah, I mean, certainly Victoria, there aren't really any frontiers in Victoria. It's a pretty small place, and the population density precludes that, I guess. Maybe, I mean, I haven't traveled to the outback, so I couldn't say, but maybe parts of Queensland would be like that.
Yeah. I thought that my favourite place in Victoria is probably Mildura, to be honest.
Right.
Okay. It's about as far as you can get from Melbourne.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I did a huge trip. Like I spent, I think, 4 months. Was it 4 or was it 5? 4 or 5 months. It was like donkey's years ago now. Traveling like right through the outback and then right across the top end from Mildura up through the middle and then right across the top end from Darwin to, well, I ended up on Thursday Island, so that's about as remote as you can get. But yeah, I think the Northern Territory still has a little bit of that. And as I was traveling, like it was me and my girl and our little Jack Russell dog in a Toyota Hilux 4x4 double cab, and we got offered like jobs to go and work on stations and stuff like that, and we did once or twice. So I think there's a little bit of that left. Although, having said that, well, like I'm going back 18 years now, I guess. So,
yeah, and also those people are a tiny percentage of the overall population. So
absolutely. Look, most Australians live in Melbourne and Sydney.
yeah,
if they don't live there, they live in Brisbane or they live in Adelaide or maybe Perth. Yeah. And that's like, I don't know, 2/3 of the Australian population, I guess.
It's a lot, yeah.
Yeah.
Go if you look at a list of settlements by population, you get onto 5 digits pretty quickly. There aren't that many places in the millions or even in the hundreds of thousands. You get down pretty quickly to 5 digits.
Well, Newcastle in northern New South Wales is a pretty big city in Australian terms.
Yes.
And actually, it used to be one of the more traditional cities in that if you went there were a lot of like stereotypical Australian people there who I actually liked. Don't get me wrong, like as I said, I came from a working class background in London. I don't really regard myself as working class these days, but I come from that background, and I kind of like the guys in Newcastle in northern New South Wales. I thought, yeah, well, actually, they're not northern New South Wales, I suppose.
Sort of central, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of central. And I like the guys there. The guys and the girls there, they seemed like good people. I just think Australia seems to be on this course of trying to destroy real Australian people. I don't know what you think about that, but that's what I've thought for certainly the last 10 years.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's a couple of things. It's, I mean, as I said, it's that whole sort of aspirational thing. It's also those people, they're just there's been a concerted effort to dismantle their culture from both the so-called left and so-called right.
Yep.
And also, they're just a tiny percentage of the population now and getting smaller every year. So, that's all of that's different now. Australia's really different to when I was a kid growing up in the 80s in Australia. Yeah. It's unrecognizable now.
I remember on Thursday Island there was a signaller. There was a there was an Australian Army signaller on Thursday Island who'd been there for quite a long time, and his girlfriend was a mate of my woman at the time, and so like when he was posted somewhere else, and when he was gonna leave, because I was in the army in UK and in South Africa afterwards, he asked me to do a speech, like because he was leaving. And I said he was a really great example of a digger, and a digger, for anyone who doesn't know, is an Australian soldier. This guy actually cried. He burst into tears because, like, if someone calls you a really good digger, that means you're a really good Australian soldier. And I wasn't totally surprised, but it was his whole identity, and that's what's being destroyed by these bloody people who don't like us at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's very much sort of time and place, and I don't think that's going to last anyway.
No,
Even
I
the
don't
younger
think it is,
people,
but it's sad, isn't it? Not sad.
of course. But I mean, even the sort of younger people from country places, I see that they've really been co-opted by modernity and consumerism and pop culture and all of this sort of stuff. They're a different breed. I mean, I guess that's just sort of part of growing up in the modern world. You're surrounded by this stuff. Even if you listen to country music or something, it's been commercialized and
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff. So these guys, I know some relatively young guys who have told me that growing up there used to be bush dances once a month, and there'd be a band, and all the local people or people from nearby towns would come along, and they don't do those things anymore. The young people aren't interested in them. So yeah.
I was impressed when I first came over and I heard Slim Dusty singing "The Pub with No Beer," which I thought was like, it's a great song.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a fan of country music myself.
No,
but,
I don't.
yeah.
I don't like country music at all. But I don't hate Slim Dusty, and I like "The Pub with No Beer." It's just cool, you know.
Yeah. Sure.
I don't know. I suppose this is funny. It's like Australia had some high culture, like in the 1890s, and I hesitate to say this because I suspect you're a much bigger expert on this than me, in terms of like high art, in terms of actual painting and music and this kind of stuff. But I do kind of think that Australia had some pretty good artists in the 1890s, for example.
Yeah. We did Tom Roberts and
Yeah.
The Heidelberg School.
Yeah. And at that stage, Australia was like well up there with most, like say, European countries, for example.
It had for a while there. Melbourne was the world's richest city, and Australia's income per capita was actually, I think, we're in the top 5 or 6 countries at one point.
Yeah.
And there was the world. What's it called? The World's Fair. I think there was 1891. The exhibition buildings in Melbourne were built for that. Something like 3 million people travelled to that. Australia had a population of about 3 million at the time. Sorry, let me just cough. Pardon me. Well, here's a statistic. So when Australia had a population of about 3 million people, there were 750,000 pianos in Australia. Most of those had to be brought out from Europe. So there's one piano for every 4 people. And given the size of families back then, that basically meant, on average, at least one piano per house. So there was all of that kind of stuff. Dame Nellie Melba, she went to Europe, and
Absolutely,
she was Australia's first. And it's so much so that the most famous French chef at the time, I can't think of his name, but he actually created that dessert in honor of her. So the peach Melba. So there was all of that. Australia was an offshoot. It was a sign of the British Empire, and wherever the Brits went, they took culture with them, and they tried to sort of recreate a little piece of the UK wherever they went. And so there was all of that in Australia as well. I mean, obviously it wasn't on the same scale as Britain itself, but that was the centre of the empire. Given that it was on the other side of the world, they had to transport all of those pianos, for instance. Sort of a 6 month journey to get them there, and there was a big thing. But that was the case everywhere. New Zealand, South Africa, Canada, everywhere they went, they did that.
Yeah. Dame Nellie Melba was probably first Australian superstar, I would say.
I think so. Yeah, probably.
She,
Yeah.
she,
Well,
she was kind of like, what's that pop singer girl called who everyone likes these days? Or used to like, I should say. She was kind of like the 19th century version of that sort of thing.
yeah. Well, except but for classical music, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Apparently, Charles Darwin, came to Australia, and this was only a generation or two after many of these places had been founded, the cities, I mean, and he was amazed at the level of sophistication and the way civilization had progressed in such a really short time in Australia. So yeah, but I mean, as I said, that was the thing. Not everyone who came to Australia was a convict, obviously. So
No.
so they brought all this culture and all of these other things with them. They tried to sort of create a small slice of Britain on a new continent.
Well, there's two things to say about that. I mean, first of all, obviously, the vast majority of settlers who came to Australia were not convicts. Like, the vast majority were not. The other thing is that the idea of sending convicts to Australia was actually almost the only penal system that ever worked, because the vast majority of the convicts who went to Australia and didn't re-offend and end up getting sent to Tasmania or something, and most of them didn't. The vast majority of the convicts sent to Australia, given a second chance, made good.
Yeah, apparently, if I remember correctly, in the really early days of the colony, it was a little bit chaotic, and then they clamped down on all of that kind of stuff, and that's when they sort of turned a lot of people around. But there was a brief period there where things were quite chaotic and debauched, and then they said, right, enough of this, and they got everyone on the straight and narrow. Yeah.
But it's almost one of the very, very few penal systems in the whole of world history that worked. The vast majority of convicts sent to Australia didn't reoffend, and a great many of them actually made a success of their lives.
Yeah, because there's a bit of a myth about convicts that they're all sort of dumb and got caught for doing dumb things. But a lot of them, the crimes for which they were convicted were actually kind of sophisticated crimes, very sort of intricate burglaries and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, they weren't all sent to Australia for stealing half a loaf of bread. No, that's true.
There were sheep rustlers or whatever.
They were complicated criminals, like you say.
And so I suppose, given the opportunity to do something, they did, and in many cases it was necessary. It was that or starve.
Yeah.
So yeah, it did turn out to be fairly successful, although there are still those sort of strains of kind of or at least there were. I think a lot of this is sort of disappearing. Actually, there was very much a sort of an attitude of anti-authoritarian, mildly criminal, enterprising behavior within the populace, and the way that say Waltzing Matilda or Ned Kelly, the way those are often sort of. I saw a guy not that long ago who was covered in Ned Kelly tattoos. So he is very much a national folk icon. So yeah, that still persists, but that was much greater, and there were positive and negative effects from that, of course. But we had very different roots, I suppose, to other places like America, for instance. Our founding myths are quite different to other places, and not everyone was a willing participant, at least initially. And so that sort of very much colored our outlook on things.
On the other hand, the Franklin, of course, slavery was always, from the time it was founded, was illegal in Australia.
Yeah.
Australia shouldn't feel any sort of national guilt over slavery because it was always illegal in Australia. Because, of course, by the time Australia was founded, it was illegal in the UK too. So that's another thing that's I think is worth pointing out to people. People arrived in Australia and it was just a completely raw wilderness. Yes, there were Aboriginal guys there, and they had some sort of culture going on. But basically, like, they couldn't build roads. They didn't have the wheel.
In Tasmania, they didn't even have fire.
Yeah. There was loads of shit going on, and out of this complete nothingness, basically, the Australian pioneers created a great Western civilization. I mean, like, I don't know. I reckon that's something to be really proud of myself. But there we go.
I do too, but we're possible. Well, I don't know whether we're in the minority, but in vocal terms, we're in the minority. That's people wouldn't say that. Like they'll call it the 26th of January Invasion Day. Very few people. Like I sort of half jokingly and half seriously call it Civilization Day, but that would be very much on the nose with most people to call it Civilization Day. Yeah.
I don't know, man. I just think, the Aboriginal people haven't, as far as I can work out, there are not less of them now than there were in the 1780s. So don't think
it actually dipped significantly. I saw this recently. So back when white people came here, I mean, these estimates always vary, but there were, say, 750,000. And apparently at the beginning of the 20th century, it got as low as 30,000. And it's back up to 500,000 or 600,000, something like that, if I remember correctly. The trouble being, of course, that there are a lot of people who identify as Aboriginal who are 1/32nd or 1/16th or something. So I think probably the number of full-blood Aborigines would be significantly lower than it would have been back in the day. But there are a lot of people who somehow have figured out that they have a great-great-grandmother or something who is Aboriginal, and they therefore claim Aboriginal status. I mean, that's to do with perverse incentives and so on as well.
Yeah. I remember I've done a few jobs in Australia, and at one stage I spent quite a long time on a 70-foot sailing ketch that went out to the Great Barrier Reef, and we did 3-day trips. We did diving and all sorts of other stuff, and we sometimes see whales and stuff, which was pretty wonderful. I actually once touched a whale, and then the whale blew all over the deck, which was extremely fishy, but it was so cool. And like, I touched a whale, I just thought, God, that was so cool. But anyway, my skipper on that boat was a third Aboriginal, I think he said. And he was a great guy, really great bloke. Can't say a bad word about him. But he regarded himself as an Australian, absolutely.
Yeah, look, I have very limited experiences with Aborigines. All I can say is I've noticed a trend in recent years of people who have a very small percentage of Aboriginal ancestry claiming Aboriginal identity. I'm sure that I have all sorts of things that I could say I'm 1/32 this or 1/16 that or what have you. But I don't see myself as those things. Actually, on my mother's side of the family, her father, he migrated after the war. He was from Essex, and I'm not sure about her mother's side of the family. They've been in Australia for quite some time, but evidently they must have been from somewhere in the east of England, because not that long ago, my mother did, both of my parents did DNA testing, and my mother's almost 3/4 Scandinavian by ancestry, and that would be the Danelaw. So, I don't go around proclaiming myself a Viking, for instance, even though those Viking relatives have probably been there for 1,200 years. They're not we're not talking Roald Dahl here. We're talking, King Canute, that kind of thing. But I don't go around saying I'm a Viking when I'm probably, say 3/8, more than a third Scandinavian, I guess, technically. But you get these guys who are 3% Aboriginal who claim that they're Aborigines.
Especially in Tasmania,
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
No, I absolutely agree with that. Okay, so I've got to ask you, Franklin, you are not a typical Australian, obviously, and I think I think typical Australians are really dying out fast at the moment. What do you think about the state of nationalism in Australia?
I mean, I have basically zero connection to any of those sort of nationalist groups, any of that kind of stuff. And then in terms of sort of more mainstream politics, I think they're trying to. It's weird because on the one hand, they're very much into this whole sort of globalist type of thing, but they're also trying to manufacture some sort of modern Australian identity. You can see it with the branding of Australia Day this year and all of this sort of stuff. They're trying to say, right, pardon me, on the one hand, we have diversity, and diversity is good, but actually we're all still Australian. I mean, I don't think that works. And I think there's a sort of a nascent anti-Chinese or anti-China sentiment.
Yeah.
And that I think Australia's on a collision course there. And so they try to frame all of this kind of Australian nationalism in terms of very liberal values, and I don't think that works. I don't think you can say, oh, we're really into diversity, we're really into multiculturalism, we're really into all these different groups' rights and all of this kind of stuff, but actually we're all really one thing. We all have this very unique identity. I mean, you can see it if you do meet people from places that are very nationalistic or that just have a monoculture, like Japanese, for instance, or even a lot of Europeans. They have a very clearly defined identity, and it's very much bound up in often in a kind of blood and soil type approach, even if they're not really aware of all of that. It's just implicit for them. I mean, we can't do that, but even civic nationalism can't really do that here. It seems like it's forced, and it seems like it's this sort of bête noire, if you like, that's let out of the box on special occasions, usually sporting events. Like, okay, it's awesome. Now we can all be really Australian because of the cricket, that kind of thing, or the Olympics or something like that. That's an acceptable outlet for it. But the rest of the time it's all, well, we're all Australians, but actually diversity. They can't square that circle. I don't think it works.
Yeah.
And in terms of politics, I mean, they're all doing the same thing, basically. They're all trying to court. It's electoral suicide to say we're going to alienate 5% of the population, let alone 25% of the population or whatever, because I mean, certainly for the major parties, because elections are won or lost on only a couple of percent. So you just can't do that. And so they're all playing this game where they're all saying, well, you can all be Australian, but or technically all you have to do is be in Australia for 5 years or whatever it is, do a test, and great, now you're as Australian as some guy who's been here his family have been here for generations.
Which
well, what does that mean?
It's nonsense, obviously.
Yeah, what does that mean? And who's going to take that seriously? So, but they've painted themselves into a corner, because how can you have nationalism without being exclusionary? By definition, you're this thing and these other people are a different thing, and some other group of people are a different thing again. And what is it exactly? Well, okay, so it's our multiculturalism. So how does that? How do we differ then from Canada or the UK or France or Germany? They're multicultural as well these days, and it's our egalitarianism. Well, pretty much every country on the planet claims to be a democracy, and we're all in favor of fairness and equality and all this stuff.
They all talk shit, yeah.
Whether they do actually practice that or not is another thing, but everyone says that. So what does that mean? How is that unique to this place? It's not. And so if you really drill down and you say to these people, well, okay, so what's really uniquely Australian? Unless they're going to sort of say, I don't know, Vegemite or kangaroos or something, right? But to build a national identity of Vegemite and kangaroos, well, no. But people can't articulate that because there's nothing to articulate.
All right, I look, as an outsider, I would say what is basically Australian is taming a wilderness, taming a particularly hard wilderness, much of which is like desert or semi-desert. I would say it is a lot of banjo paterson, for example, is basically what Australians are. Like banjo paterson, for anyone who is not an Australian, is kind of like the Aussie version of Rudyard Kipling. I don't know. I think the Franklin would say that was reasonably fair.
Yeah.
He talks about like Australians taming the wilderness. He talks about ringers, which is the Australian version of a cowboy, out in the outback, doing their stuff with cows and horses and all this kind of stuff. I think that's as close as you're ever going to get. Combined with the Anzac legend, that's where Australia's real identity comes from. It's the Anzac legend combined with banjo paterson, and it's not bad as these things go. It's not bad at all.
That said, even in his day, there was, and he sort of lamented the fact that there was tension between the city and the country, and that a lot of Australians, perhaps even the majority then, I'm not sure, didn't live on the land. So, as an example, on my father's side of the family, I'm the sixth generation to have lived in a particular suburb of Melbourne. At one point or another, 6 generations of us have lived in that suburb. I lived there as a child. My father lived there as an adult. My grandfather grew up there. His father would have been an adult when he lived there. All that, and actually, there's a suburb named after my family. A street named after my family in that suburb. So, at least 6 generations on one line of my family have not lived on the land. They were urbanites, if you like. Well, I mean, it was pretty undeveloped even back then. They had market gardens and all that kind of stuff in some of these areas. But nevertheless, even going back that far, so you'd be going back into the late 19th century, there was that tension between people who had always been urbanites and those who lived on the land. So that's been sort of the perennial problem in Australia in terms of identity. So even then, I think maybe people probably could identify with, say, Banjo Patterson's poems more in the past, but there was still that tension even in those days.
Yeah, I agree with you totally, but I just think that, like your family, for example, or obviously if you've been around that many generations, you will have some generations in the town, but you would basically be involved in the land. And I don't think the fact that someone's in a city makes them like not of that nation. I mean, you've got to look at. I don't know if you have you read Russell Braddon, for example, The Naked Island. Well, he was an Aussie guy, very middle class Aussie guy, who joined the Australian Imperial Force in World War II, and got sent to Singapore and got captured by the Japanese, but also gave the Japanese a couple of pretty good bloody noses along the way, and detested them, and rightly detested them for some of the things they did, and then later on kind of forgave them. I read that book when I was like 12, and it was my dad's book, and my dad really wasn't very happy that I'd read it because some parts of it are really nasty. I don't know. I just think there is a unity between city and land, but there isn't between Melbourne and the outback. Does that make any sense?
Oh, sure. I just meant that the Australian identity was not. It was nuanced even back in. There was a national identity, I think, certainly, but it was nuanced even back then. It was nuanced within sort of the context of everyone being broadly of the same culture, of the same ethnic stock, all of that kind of thing, or broadly being under the umbrella of the British Empire, Western civilization, that sort of thing. Yeah, absolutely. There was an overarching culture, if you like, but it was nuanced within that.
And I think like the country guys join the Australian Light Horse, and the city guys join like the infantry battalions, that kind of thing.
Yeah, you'd probably know better than I would on that.
Well, it is one of the things I study, but yeah, I don't know. Obviously Australia's always had a certain dichotomy because of the Irish element.
Absolutely,
yeah. I think that is one of the only good things about modern Australia. I think that's pretty much dead these days.
Yeah, I think so too. I still see traces of it, and I see it more in the countryside. Yeah, but yeah, it was a much bigger thing when I was a kid.
Yeah, I think it's mainly when I first got here in 2000, there was still a little bit of it, but I think it's been dying really big time since then. And I think that's almost the only good thing I would say about modern Australia is that the Brit-Irish thing is almost dead now. But it was dying long before, like there were many Irish Australians who were huge heroes in World War I and World War II. So,
Oh, sure. It was more. It was also because it was a religious thing too, and actually, a guy I knew years and years ago, he said, when I was growing up, a mixed marriage was one parent was Irish Catholic and the other was Anglo Protestant. And that was a difficult thing, obviously, because of the religious element. So that I think that kind of exacerbated it in a way that, I have German ancestry from the 19th century. They're from South Australia. Those guys assimilated really quickly because they were Protestants and they just got absorbed. The Irish Catholics, because of the religious element, I think that kind of kept them separate for quite some time.
Yeah. I'm a bit biased because my mother was an Irish Catholic and my father was a English Protestant Anglo guy. So, yeah, absolutely. Okay, the next question I've got to ask you, Franklin, how do you think Australian nationalism is now?
Well, like I said, I think everything's sort of in flux. I think they're trying to square a circle that can't be squared. And I think
Excuse me.
Is that a dog?
Yes, my Jack Russell. I have a 12-year-old Jack Russell rescue dog. I'm still choking. Excuse me. Yeah, I have a 12-year-old cross Jack Russell rescue dog. What I was trying to say is, how do you think Australian nationalism stands now, in terms of, like, I don't know, Australia is the traditional nation that it is?
So can you elaborate on that, please?
Well, obviously, Australia is traditionally an Anglo-Celtic nation, like the rest of the old Commonwealth. Yes, it's got Greeks and Italians and all that kind of stuff, and later many other people. But where do you think Australian nationalism, in the sense of keeping Australia Australian, where do you think it stands now?
Well, I think it's at a kind of an inflection point, and has been for some time, in that they've thrown all that under the bus. I mean, I think it's quite likely that within my lifetime they'll change the flag and they'll remove the Union Jack from the flag, because they're very much ashamed. They're sort of the elites, at least in the what we might call the cathedral, the media, and all of these people, academics and so on. They're very much ashamed of our British past. In fact, they're very much ashamed of sort of anything prior to 2000, and so they don't want to say anything nice about those times. And how can you square that circle if you say, well, traditionally it's an Anglo-Celtic settlement? How does everyone else fit into that in a multicultural society? So I think that's and as fewer and fewer people are of Anglo-Celtic stock, all that's going to be meaningless. I mean, as a kid, we did. I remember in grade 5 we did social studies assignments on Australian explorers. We all had to pick an Australian explorer, and do your standard kind of 10-year-old school project on this guy. I did Major Mitchell, and all these guys did Bass and Flinders and Burke and Wills and all these kinds of guys. Well, in a sense, that made sense because we could look at those guys and say, yeah, I could relate to one of those guys. But if you're a Chinese guy or an Indian guy or something who's been in this country for 10 years, what relevance do any of those guys? What relevance does Captain Cook have? I mean, you just hear and any sort of arguments to the effect of, well, you're the beneficiary of those crusty old white dudes. They don't buy that. They're just like, no, we're a modern nation. And so, I mean, I hate to say it, but I think that all of that's largely dead, and it's not going to go forwards, because if you have a class where 20% of the the kids are Anglo-Celtic, and you're going to do, and every assignment's going to be about some old white guy from 200 years ago or 150 years ago, whatever. They're just not going to do that. They're just not going to push that. So I think in that regard, it's largely dead. It's dying or dead, and it will. And my generation perhaps will be the last generation that has any memory of that kind of stuff, where it was just standard that you did a grade 5 social studies assignment on, an Australian explorer. I don't think that's the norm now. I imagine they do, social studies assignments on different cultural festivals, Diwali or Ramadan or whatever, or Chinese New Year or what have you. I imagine that's what the kind of stuff that they do, and that's the way they're trying to go forwards. Now, I don't know how that can work as a sort of a national identity in the future. It's a bit like, I imagine, say, in the 11th century in England. So you had all these different groups. You had Anglo-Saxons, you had Vikings, and you had Normans. Now, fast forward several hundred years, and there was an English identity that had come out of that. But we can still see the sort of the differences even in place names in the UK and all of that kind of stuff. But there was something that came out of that eventually, that sort of melting pot. Now, the groups involved now are significantly more different to each other than the Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, or Normans were from one another. How well is that going to work? I don't think it is going to work very well. And how well is it going to work, say, if Australia had a war with China? How would that work? Would you get a whole bunch of Chinese guys living in Box Hill signing up to fight for Australia? How would you know that they weren't going to be spies? All of that kind of stuff. Would people go and fight for Australia in that kind of situation? I don't think a lot of them would.
I think a lot of the real Australians would. Still.
Yeah, oh, sure. A lot of them would, but they're few and far between, and a lot of the CC people wouldn't.
No, absolutely they wouldn't. I'm not arguing that for a second. I mean, I'm thinking of my Australian woman, and her father came from Scotland and moved to Australia. I think his family came over here when he was like 6 or 7, and he joined the Royal Australian Air Force in World War II, and he got a medal for repairing the engines on his Catalina flying boat behind Japanese lines that they kind of broke down and had to land at some atoll or something. And he repaired the engines and got some sort of medal for that, which she was extremely proud of. Like, that was probably one of the most things she was proud of about her family. And I think there are still quite a lot of Australians who have that kind of heritage.
Yeah, sure, but it's diminishing, and I mean, I see it with younger people. They've really been, and there've been several generations now of people who've been on the receiving end of a certain kind of conditioning at school, if you like.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think the interesting thing will be, as someone has mentioned in the chat, what will happen if and when Anglo-Celtic people in this country are no longer the majority, and there's a sort of plurality of different groups.
End of Australia, surely.
Well, yes.
As we understand it.
Yes, and that it'll be every man for himself, and at that point it would be very hard to have any kind of national unity in the face of external threats and that sort of thing. Obviously, I think that would be a really bad thing, but I think that's the trajectory on which we've been for quite some
Yeah.
time.
You're
So-
pretty black-pilled, aren't you, on a lot of this stuff?
Yes and no. The other way that I come at this again is sort of from that perspective of, if you had looked at England in the 11th century, it looked pretty chaotic in that sense that you had Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, and Normans. And yet eventually something came out of that. Now, that wasn't a prissy process by any stretch of the imagination. There were definite winners and losers in that. And there was a lot of energy released in that process. Eventually something came out of that, and eventually that has happened in a lot of places in the world. Now, would Australia end up like that, or would it end up permanently balkanized? Would it end up sort of permanently like the Middle East, where you have lots of different ethno-religious groups all living side by side, and periodically that all flares up? I don't know, but I guess the sort of white-pilled way of coming at this is to say we're coming to the end of an era, and you can lament that, or you can say the white-pilled way is we're at the beginning of a new era, and we can kind of some certain people at least can have an outsized influence upon the future in that regard, because everything is on the table, everything is up for grabs. Certain people, if they're willing to be bold, if they're willing to be sort of Nietzschean or Faustian or something, can actually have long-lasting effects upon whatever the new thing is that comes out of all of this.
Do you think that Anglo-Celtic Australia is doomed?
In what sense do you mean doomed?
Well, it's not going to be the majority ruling groups of Australia.
Well, I think the majority and the ruling are two different things there. I think just in sheer numbers, there is likely to come a point where Anglo-Celtic people are not the majority. Although, yeah, there'll be so much sort of mixing, and there already is, that it's quite likely that a lot of people will have some ancestry. So there's that. In terms of ruling, I don't know. Ruling elites can cling on as a very tiny percentage of the population.
I don't care about the elites. I'm more talking about like the majority population, really.
Yeah, I think, I don't know. The only way I could see this kind of stopping is if people generally just decide for whatever that we actually can't increase the population anymore by immigration, maybe for environmental reasons, or maybe just because we need to sort of sort ourselves out because of external threats. Like if the sort of global order were to collapse, and I think that's on its way out. I mean, we can see, I think you want to get on to talking about the US at some point.
Yeah,
but I think that's on its
minute, yeah.
I think that's on its way out. And so maybe if that all goes its own way, falls apart, and we go our own way, it could be like there were things that emerged from the collapse of the Roman Empire and became these new things. Now, it might be that we say, well, look, we can't ever have 50 million people in this country because we just don't have enough water, for instance. Maybe we'll get to that point. And ironically, maybe a lot of the people who want to end immigration will be relatively recent immigrants themselves. And they might be more red-pilled on this kind of stuff than the sort of paused Anglo-Celtic remnants. I don't know, but the trajectory upon which we find ourselves currently is that that's going to happen within a couple of generations.
Yeah. No, I don't disagree with any of that. I'm a little bit more optimistic, though. I think it's going to take quite a lot to make Australia not an Anglo-Celtic nation at base. I know it's getting more multicultural. Sadly, so is the UK. So is Canada. So is New Zealand. All sadly, in my view. but I think it's going to take quite a lot to actually remove that from the top of the tree. And if Australia wasn't Anglo-Celtic, it wouldn't be Australia.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think a deeper problem actually that people on the right often fail to address is that a lot of the Anglo-Celtic population themselves have been completely deracinated, if you like. They've been completely divorced from their original culture, and so in that respect, maybe there isn't that much difference between a person who's walking through a shopping mall in Melbourne or at a cafe in Melbourne who is of Anglo-Celtic heritage and someone who's of some other kind of heritage. They've all just become these sort of modern blobs, sort of this modern blob culture. And that's why in many regards, those people, I mean, you could pick them up and put them down in any sort of big Western city anywhere in the world, and they would fit in quite successfully because there's this sort of modern blob culture everywhere, and increasingly in non-Western parts of the world. So I think that before anyone can sort of even really start pointing the finger at all these other ethnic groups, they need to look at themselves and say, well, what does the average Anglo-Celtic person really know about their history and their culture and all of that sort of stuff?
Totally agree. I mean, I'll give you a couple of cases in point. I mean, a couple of good Australian films. And Australia actually makes quite a lot of good movies for a relatively small country in population terms. The Light Horseman is a great film. It's about one of the last great cavalry charges in history in Palestine in 1917. And the Australian Light Horse, who were really mounted infantrymen, actually made a real cavalry charge. And they either put their great big 18-inch bayonets on their short magazine Lee Enfield rifles, or they used them as short swords. And it's a completely true story. They did that. And they moved so fast that the Turks couldn't lower the range of their guns quickly enough. And so they overran the Turkish positions and captured the Germans who were actually running the Turks. They captured their HQ. Brilliant film, and it's actually very accurate and tells you at the end of the movie what happened to some of these individual soldiers.
Yeah.
And I don't know, have you seen it?
No, I know the story.
It's a movie. It's a movie worth watching, actually. And then much more recently, last year, we had Danger Close: The Battle of Long Tan, where one company of an Australian infantry battalion, so like 100-odd blokes, basically, was attacked by something like 3,000 main force North Viet Cong, and they won. I mean, they lost quite a lot of guys, not that many, but they lost quite a lot of guys, but they won. And like they were outnumbered enormously. And a lot of the reason that both those two units won was kind of like the Australian legend, the idea of what Australians were, if you understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah, sure. But that's a very different experience, I think, a very different set of conditions to our current set of conditions.
Yeah, absolutely right. I agree totally. But I think there's still a lot of Australians, particularly if you go to an Anzac Day thing, if you're allowed to go to an Anzac Day thing because of these bullshit lockdowns, where you can see that the vast majority of Australians, and that includes women and children as well, actually do see that as like one of the kind of it's one of the driving forces of Australia.
Yeah, the thing I dislike about those kinds of things is the way they've been sort of retconned, and now a lot of these things have sort of whatever the sort of social justice issue du jour is, feminism or this group's rights or that group's rights, diversity basically, that's all been sort of attached to that. And so it's this sort of spectacle. It's in everything, everywhere you go, to the extent that any part of Australian culture that predates 2000 and sort of the very rapid demographic change, or certainly anything that predates World War II, they have to if they allow that to be celebrated, and a lot of it is not, obviously, because it's like evil white men and all of that kind of thing, to the extent that they still allow certain things, pardon me, or haven't been able to overturn them because they're just too popular, they've sort of played, pinned the tail on the donkey. And it's like, okay, how can we add this element of the current year thinking onto that, when in reality the guys who fought in World War I, almost to a man, would have been racist, sexist, homophobic, you name it, and and so they have to kind of say, all right, well, it's a little bit too popular. We can't brush this under the rug. We have to let them celebrate this thing. But okay, we have to pin on all these other things. It's strange. I don't quite know how all of that works, but it's in everything now. Everywhere you go, they do all this stuff. It's in all of these organizations, everything. It's unavoidable now. And so you can't just have the thing in and of itself, for itself, on its own terms. So I don't know, what's that? What's that? Like my ancestors who fought in the First and Second World Wars, if they could see all of this now, would they recognize it? Would it be immediately obvious to them that that's what people were celebrating? Or
they would be rolling in their graves, and you damn well know it.
Right. So okay. Well, I mean, what does any of this stuff mean anymore? Right. It's also postmodern. It's also, we will impose our own meaning onto these things because this is what we deem important in the current year. Therefore, this must be inserted into everything, including these things that
homo,
that are from a completely different time and have. And these two things are completely at odds with each other, have no connection or whatever, but they must insert these things into everything. So that's kind of this weird sort of situation we're at with
it's
modern national identity.
I don't know if you agree with me, but it's like basically white people bad, straight white men especially bad, and that's really all it amounts to if you strip away everything else from it.
Yeah, although I think white women are actually still they're probably the most privileged group of people in the country.
They are,
still.
but I think
it's a weird thing.
I agree totally, but I think they're the next ones to be knocked off the stack.
Yeah,
they're the ones who are going to be knocked off next, and they haven't seen it yet, many of them, but they will be. They'll be the next ones knocked off. Like I said, I think it's white people bad. Straight white men, totally evil.
Oh, yeah. I think for now, at least for a little bit, white women will enjoy a certain amount of privilege for a bit longer. But I think it's coming for them too, of course. But there's definitely a significant disparity in the way men and women, white men and women, are regarded.
Hugely. Listen, the Franklin, I started following you via Stardust, the Thinking Age.
Yeah.
And you and also Coltane were a couple of the people I started following at the same time. I'm not going to interview Coltane because I think I would argue with him more than was worth doing.
Right.
Like, I like him. I think he makes great videos, and much of what he says is very sensible, but I don't agree with all of it. And part of it is because my politics and his are a bit different, I suspect.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's a case of someone who's taken a red pill, but not the entire jar, shall we say?
Yeah. But I mean, that's my thinking on that stuff. I mean, I'm a bit like Brutus, for example. I know Brutus came into, shall we say, reactionary right-wing politics via the manosphere. I kind of did that too.
Yeah, right.
So, yeah, I get that. And yes, absolutely. Men are straight white men, most evil people in the entire world. Even if we did make nearly all the advances in the world that made it what it is. I mean, you know, I say we, that's like pushing my luck, but you know what I mean?
And it's all that sort of absurd stuff like 25% of women are 25% of homeless people are women most affected by homelessness. You know, it's all that kind of stuff, right?
And
like,
it's usually actually about 13% rather than 25%.
Yeah. Right? And it's all that sort of thing of women are the you know, when guys go to war and die, actually women are most affected.
Yeah, I know.
What? You know, yeah, of course, you know, and men are more likely to die in the workplace, and they have worse educational outcomes and suicide and lower life expectancy, but you know, women most affected. Yeah.
Average age for a man to die in UK, I know, is 79. Women, 83. So, you know, it's it's there's a load of nonsense, but we live in the age of nonsense, basically.
Yeah,
you know,
clown world.
Yeah, we do. It's just bullshit. Okay, let me ask you something else. Kanzuk. What do you think about Kanzuk? Like closer links between UK, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand.
Okay, I could say a few kind of somewhat glib criticisms. I don't want Jacinda Ardern coming over here, or Justin Trudeau for that matter. I don't want closer ties with those two. And look, the problem is, of course, that all of these places are in the same boat that we're in. That when you say, okay, closer ties with the UK, does that mean a guy like you, or does that mean a guy who's lives in Rotherham, shall we say? Right?
Hopefully it's a guy like me.
Is that what we're talking about? I mean, in theory, I think, yeah, great. And it's sort of like the core remnants of the British Empire and our sort of ancestry. Yeah, in theory, great, because we're all just branches of the same tree. But the practicality of it might not work out that way. And you know, we're all just these sort of globo homo modern blob nations now. I don't quite know what that would mean.
We might fight back though. We might fight back.
Yeah, maybe, or we could just find ourselves beset from more sides. You know, as I said, I don't want Jacinda Ardern or Justin Trudeau coming over here, if at all.
Listen, New Zealand's just got the worst abortion laws.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah,
like you can be aborted for having a cleft lip. You can be aborted for being a boy if your mother wants a girl, and you can be aborted up to the day you are due to be born. And if you somehow survive, they can kill you. It's insane. I mean, I just can't believe that Western civilized nations would accept that sort of thing. And of course, she's done it under the cover of all this China virus nonsense.
Yeah, sure. I mean, but this is what I mean. That what does what, like, the sort of idea of New Zealand and the say the Anzacs,
Where
that is New Zealand. I mean, yes, in some part, but in another way, no, it's just in the Ardern and that whole thing. So I don't know. We need to sort these things out.
it's not exactly the All Blacks. It's not exactly the All Blacks and a haka, is it?
No, but even that's like what's that about, right? Like, you get white guys doing the haka, right? What's
Well, I
this?
don't know. I actually don't mind the New Zealanders doing that because, look, I'm a military historian. Like, from the age of 17, I've written military history, and the Maori in New Zealand during the Maori Wars, they did occasionally do fairly gallant things with British wounded. Like, they didn't eat them. They sometimes, like, put them somewhere where they wouldn't get killed. And the British reciprocated. There was a certain respect eventually between the forces because they both fought very hard. And also they both had a sense of humor. Like, one of the things the Maoris have that I have noticed Aboriginals don't is a sense of humor. I have a Maori friend. Aboriginal guys tend not to have much of a sense of humor in the Western sense. I think Maoris do. So I think there was a certain, like, two-way respect between those guys. So I'm not absolutely against white New Zealand guys doing a haka, right? Yeah, okay, fair enough. It's their thing, it's their thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's modern New Zealand thing. That's what I mean. It
Well,
just
it's
looks
not
a bit
really modern, though,
strange
is
to me.
it?
No, I mean modern in the sense that would a white guy have done that 100 years ago? Probably not.
I'd need to look it up, but I'm pretty sure that the New Zealand rugby team has done hakas since certainly in the 1930s, maybe the 1920s,
Including the white guys.
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
I think so. I'd need to look it up, but I think so.
Okay.
Um,
Maybe they would then. Okay.
But there was, like I said, there was a certain respect between both sides. Like, they were fighting, but they kind of realized that both sides were pretty brave. If you see what I mean.
Yeah. Sure.
A bit like the Eighth Army and the Afrika Korps in North Africa in the Second World War. Like, they were fighting each other, but both sides were pretty fair. Like, the Afrika Korps didn't, generally speaking, murder prisoners, nor did the British. And so there was a certain amount of respect,
Yeah, sure.
So I think it was kind of that. I mean, I'd need to look that up. It's an interesting point. But I know for a fact that the New Zealand rugby union team did hakas in the 30s. I think they did them in the 20s. And I know for a fact also HMS New Zealand, which was a battle cruiser in the First World War, and she was one of the worst armored battle cruisers of all of the fleet. At the Battle of Jutland in 1916, when a couple of British battle cruisers blew up because their armor was too thin, the captain of HMS New Zealand, he put on a traditional Maori kind of warriors thing, yeah, that he'd been given by Maoris in New Zealand. And HMS New Zealand wasn't even hit by a German shell.
Right.
So this is how superstition becomes truth, perhaps. I don't know. But he did that, and she wasn't hit. And she did hit the enemy. So yeah, same thing with HMS Ajax. I think it was. Was it Ajax or Achilles? It was one of those two, who was fighting the Graf's Bay in the Second World War, the Battle of the River Plate, and one of those ships was a New Zealand ship. And again, the captain of the ship had a traditional Maori dress that he put on when the battle started. Ship wasn't hit.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I didn't know that.
I don't know, man. I kind of quite like the Maoris. I think they had their thing going on, you know.
Oh, sure. I mean, I didn't really have much of an opinion about them, actually.
Well, the thing is, if the Maoris are indigenous to New Zealand, then the British are certainly indigenous to Britain, because the British were in Britain at least 1,000 years before the Maoris were.
Yeah.
But so you got to look at that. But yeah, but I'm not anti-Maori at all.
Well, neither am I. I mean, I'm not anti anyone. Actually, I'm pro my own side. You know. Yeah.
Yeah. So so what you're saying about Kanzuk, I see totally, but like my kind of support for it is the idea that maybe we can get control of our borders and keep Anglo-Celtic people in charge, if you like. That's my thinking. Like if UK and Canada and Australia and New Zealand can actually get control of their borders and keep the Anglo-Celtic people in charge, then Kanzuk to me is an entirely good idea.
Oh yeah, as I said, in theory, I think it's a good idea.
And I know some Australian naval people, and my boy's going to be out here this year later on, hopefully, on HMS Queen Elizabeth, the aircraft carrier, with a British task group. And I know for a fact there's quite a lot of Australian naval types who are quite looking forward to that, because they feel that's a counter pressure against the Chinese Communist Party.
Right. Yeah, that would make sense. Yeah. I think I do think that Australia's going to have to figure out what it's going to do going forwards, and maybe we can use this as a segue to talking about America, because I do think that it's at least partially foolish for us to think that we're going to be able to depend upon the American world order, most notably against China in the relatively near future.
Agreed.
So I think we're going to have to make our own arrangements one way or another. So if we could do that with other nations with which we have a lot more in common, rather than having to hobble together some sort of regional alliance, that would be very good. But who knows?
Yeah, no, I agree totally. I mean, what we're seeing in the US at the moment, I greatly admire the patriots in America who occupied the Capitol. I think it's disgusting that cop shot that poor bloody unarmed woman through a door who was no threat to him and killed her. But I admire those patriots who occupied the Capitol. But all I've seen since then is that Globo Homo and the Democrats and their left-wing useful idiots are trying to speed up making that senile, pedophile, corrupt wank Biden president. So, yeah, okay, that's what I think. I don't know what you think.
I feel sorry for those guys, those patriots in America, because I think they're up against a huge problem and they don't really have any power to do much about it. But in many ways, for a lot of those guys, it's probably their last roll of the dice, because America's in a much worse situation than Australia, for instance. And I think a lot of those guys know that their backs are against the wall, and a decade from now, a lot of them might not even be alive, but they're going to be picked apart, like a child picking apart a fly, picking the wings off a fly or something. I think they realize that their backs are against the wall, and they realize that, flawed as he might be and have been, Trump was perhaps their best bet in a long time.
Yep.
And no one else was really on their side or looking out for them. And so they've gone all in. They realize that, to use another analogy, this is the best hand they've had for 20 minutes. And they're bleeding chips, so they have to go all in on this hand. And they're probably still going to lose. They've got, I don't know, a pair of threes or something. They're probably still going to lose this hand. But it's the best hand they've had in a long time. And they're all in on it. And I don't think they're going to be successful. And I think a lot of these guys will end up in jail for a long time. And but it was their last hurrah, I think, for a lot of them. It's kind of sad. America's just going to descend into a complete disaster. 10 years from now, America will be washed up. And these guys know it. But what can they do? That's all they can do. It's sort of a fairly ineffectual gesture, because no one else is supporting them. What else can they do?
All right. Well, this is what I think. I did 2 tours in Northern Ireland with the British Army in the mid-80s, shall we say. The provisional IRA, which is basically Marxist, and if you don't believe me, go and look at Sinn Féin, which is their so-called political wing in the Republic of Ireland. And Sinn Féin totally supports mass third-world immigration into Ireland. But the provisional IRA, PIRA, never had more than, at very most, about 400 active fighters, terrorists. Well, they were terrorists, but guys who would plant bombs, fire guns, this kind of shit. They never had more than a small handful of real military veterans, generally from the British Army, sadly. And of course, the British Army was mostly concerned with protecting civilians, but we were also trying to defeat the provisional IRA, and we did kill quite a lot of them, thank God. But Northern Ireland is tiny, relatively speaking, okay? And what I would say is that the USA is an enormous nation. As the Franklin would well know, it's about the same size as Australia, minus Alaska, but with less deserts. The rural and small towns and little cities are almost all basically in sympathy with the Patriots. There were, about 76 million votes for Trump, even if you allow for the Democrat con jobs. If even 10% of those people support Trump, that's 7.6 million people. If 5% support him, that's still over 3 million people.
3.8, yeah.
Yeah. And the American patriots don't have like literally 3 or 6 or 7 military veterans on their side like the Provisional IRA did. They have thousands upon thousands upon thousands of real combat veterans from the rank of general downwards who've been fighting in all these useless wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, etc., and have seen action and fought and killed people and been fired out. Huge difference again. In addition to that, the American patriots have access to millions of small arms, like millions. There are more firearms in the USA than there are people. In addition to all of that, the globo homo types, the Democrats basically, and the corporate globo homo scum that are also in power in UK and probably in Australia too. These guys, they cannot depend on the US military because the vast majority of the actual trigger pullers, like, the guys in the fighting units of the US Marine Corps and the American Army, not the transport guys and the supply guys and all the black women that join all those fucking supply units, the guys who actually do the fighting, everyone from the good company officers downwards in the fighting units of the US Army and the US Marine Corps, they are basically in sympathy with the patriots. So those corporate globalist scum and their useful moron left-wing allies can't rely on those guys at all because they probably won't fire on them and will also probably give them information and do all sorts of other things. I think at the moment the USA is as close to a civil war as it has been since 1865. And the reason for that is because the Democrats and their Republican in name-only allies, the rhinos, are pushing it that way with their obvious and huge election steal. So I don't know.
Yeah, I don't dispute that. I think a couple of problems though are, firstly, Trump himself doesn't seem to be too let me just say that there are a lot of things he could have done and that he could have done a long time ago that he didn't and hasn't. So it's like, there are all these guys who are willing to fight for him and he's not even willing to really do anything other than
he's
tweet a lot. Well, he can't even do that now. And
he can't because they've stopped it.
Yeah,
he's holding the line hard now, man.
Yeah, the other thing is that it's also about, you need to have some kind of institutional elite support. You need to have some segment of the elite who are on your side.
I don't agree with that. I actually don't agree with that. The patriots in America have guys on the military side up to general rank, and they do have some civil politicians on their side. But politicians in the modern Western world are such shitbags that really.
I'm not just talking about the politicians. I'm talking about people in other sectors of society as well. The problem that they're going to face is that, yes, I think that this is a tinderbox right now, but the approach that they're going to take and that they've been taking for decades is to boil the frog. So as long as to mix my metaphors, as long as the tinderbox doesn't go off and they can boil the frog.
Yeah, I think they've just lost that. I think they lost
you could well be right about that. I think what they're going to do is they're going to throw the floodgates open in terms of immigration, and
that won't make any difference though. It will take too long. I think what happened yesterday was the Patriots occupied the Capitol. They sat in the speaker's chair. They took the hard drives from that horrible, vile old witch Pelosi's office. I think that stuff can't be worked back. And they pushed.
They've looked, and they looked very weak too.
They pushed the police back, not because, and I've seen people saying this rubbish. They're saying, "Oh, the police let them." No, they didn't. They pushed the police back because our globo homo overlords didn't remember that thousands upon thousands of Trump supporters are actual real combat veterans.
Oh, sure, I don't disagree with
because
all
of their
that.
damn stupid wars, which I didn't agree with at all. I think it depends what Trump does, obviously, but I think if America doesn't have some sort of guerrilla civil war now, well, someone's going to come up and say something that I don't know about at the moment.
Look, I think there's a non-trivial chance. I think the US is going to become ungovernable within my lifetime. It's going to become a balkanized state at best, or there'll be a sort of an ongoing insurgency. I think all of that's on the cards at some point, and things are going to continue to deteriorate. But I think things are going to get a bit worse before they could look like getting better. As I said, I think there'll be an attempt to boil the frog, and a lot of that will be done by denying people jobs. It will be done by moving certain people into their neighborhoods, all of this kind of stuff. It'll get sort of done behind the scenes. One of the things that administrations do is they get to appoint thousands and thousands of people to all sorts of minor and major posts, and the left have been very insidious in this regard at slowly boiling the frog. And it's not necessarily in really flamboyant, obvious ways, the way that they do it.
I don't know. I think, like, what we saw yesterday in Washington, D.C. was the right without weapons, just, like, pushing through the police just because these guys, a lot of these guys were like combat veterans and didn't give a shit. And like, you know, you could spray them with CS gas or pepper spray, and they'd either spray you back or just walk through them. These are not Antifa soy boys. And I just think the next time that happens, 20,000 of these guys are going to have guns, and the police are going to run away.
You could well be right.
Very sensibly, by the way, I think the police will run away. And I also think that, like, the idea that you can deploy the National Guard, who are part-time soldiers in America, who, like, many of them are sympathetic with the Patriots anyway, and they're part-time soldiers, they're not regulars. And like, you know, part-time soldiers, they're good, brave individuals. But they ain't regulars. Regulars will just fucking destroy them every time. And in any case, half of the National Guard guys in the USA sympathize with the Patriots and will just make themselves scared. And if they then try and deploy, like, the real T-farms, the fighting guys, like of the US Marine Corps or the US Army, again, the best officers in those units, like the best company commanders, will sympathize with the Patriots. Many lieutenants will sympathize with the Patriots. The vast majority of NCOs and men will sympathize with the Patriots. You know, because
I don't disagree with you at all. Yeah,
they're not the supply and transport units full of African American black women, and who gives a shit what they think, because it doesn't matter. You know, Globo Homo is facing a huge crisis in America, and I think us on the right, we've got to hope that the Americans win, because if they do, it gives everyone, like in Australia, in Britain, Canada, and New Zealand, a huge lift. a huge lift. Like, it makes it possible, for example, for British people to consider getting rid of Alexander Boris Johnson, who is a left-wing guy masquerading as being a right-wing guy. That's my own opinion about all this. And I speak as a former British soldier, and then I was a soldier in the SADF. I spent 12 years as an infantry soldier, and I think I have a little bit of understanding of what's happening from that point of view, if none other.
So I don't disagree. I think there's a non-trivial chance that this year everything could kick off, and I think in the long term, America is not going to exist as we know it. There will be some resolution to this. It may be protracted, but there will be some resolution to this at some point. But it's a bit like a game of chicken, I guess.
Yeah,
let's see who's going to blink first.
Yeah, none of us know. But I mean, I just looked at the photographs. I don't know if you saw them, of all these guys in the American House, like hiding under their chairs.
Oh yeah. That's a bad look, isn't it? Because they've really been rattled, and they've really been shown as not the sort of children of the gods, if you like. You know, the emperor is mortal, just like us, right?
People got into there and they sat in the speaker's chair, and they took the hard drive from that horrible, vile old witch Nancy Pelosi's computer. I mean, who knows what they're going to find on there for a start? I don't know. I think it's hopeful. That is
sure.
The only hopeful thing I've seen in the last year.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting. There's that. I mean, the Australian media's already spinning it, of course. It's
I just don't watch the MSM. I mean, look, it's like the MSM is just total globo homo feminist left-wing propaganda. That's all it is. And I'm sure you would know the Franklin, pretty much like most state school teachers are these days. It's just globo homo feminist left-wing propaganda.
Oh yeah, sure. It's a bit like that sort of old joke about Pravda, how some people used to read it as comedy and some people used to read it as fact. It's just that they would believe the complete opposite of whatever was printed in Pravda. Yeah, it's like that. And I can see them sort of trying to spin it, but to me, they don't seem like they're fully confident. They've been rattled, certainly. And their response will be, or from their point of view, should be quite harsh, because if they don't have a show of strength, then really the wheels are going to fall off this thing.
But no one is going to believe that the totally corrupt, senile, pedophile Biden is a legitimate president. No one's going to believe that.
No, it seems like even the Democrats don't really. They're trying to fake it till they make it, kind of thing.
And then he's got his vile, absolutely scumbag bitch running mate Harris. I mean, come on. I just don't believe anyone, even if somehow or another, which is quite likely, the Democrats con something to like make the pedophile senile Biden president and scumbag Harris vice president. No one's going to think they're legitimate. It's basically the US at this stage is a banana republic.
Yeah.
It's a very big, very powerful banana republic. It ain't any sort of democracy.
Well, arguably, it hasn't been for a long time, if ever.
Yeah, I know. I'm not a full-on supporter of democracy either. I believe in household democracy. Like, I think there should be, if you own a certain amount of property, yeah, you can vote. And I would also, obviously, give the vote to people who serve in the armed forces. And that would be my limit. I don't believe in this one man, let alone one woman vote. I think it's crap.
Oh, sure, and that's going to go the way of the dinosaur anyway within the next century. I mean, I think probably a lot of Western leaders are looking at this whole episode with a series of alarm, and I mean, in some ways they'd be kind of red-pilled about things, in other ways blue-pilled. But the interesting thing will be other countries. I mean, I'm sure obviously Putin and Xi Jinping and so on must be laughing at the moment. But a lot of other countries...
Putin, to be honest. I think Putin's moderately neutral. I don't think the Chinese are. I think the Chinese absolutely are right.
Well, I mean, just from the point of view of this is going to give a lot of people a lot of ways to push back against the US if and when the US starts throwing its weight around again. Anyone who has any balls will just say, look, your democracy's a joke. Don't lecture us about democracy. Fix your own house before you tell us to fix ours.
And that's assuming the right doesn't continue to fight back. And many people I respect in America, mostly military veteran guys, think the right is going to keep fighting back.
That's good. That's interesting.
And harder.
Yeah, well, as I said, I think long term, I think that's going to happen. I just don't know when.
I tell you what, Franklin, I've had people in UK, and UK is even more disarmed than Australia, of course. Like in Australia, you can still get a 303 rifle if you want one. Not the case in the UK. And I've had people were telling me for weeks before today, because I've been saying something's going to happen on the 6th. It's going to be a real big deal. And it was. You know, the right occupied the building. And people in the UK haven't understood. And it pains me to say this greatly, because I like to think the British guys are the best guys in the world. And when I say British guys, I also include Australians, Canadians, and New Zealanders. But Americans are not like that. Americans still have more of that frontier thing we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I think this is why this has happened. And I think if the Democrats and their rhino allies push this, they're going to push America into some sort of guerrilla war in Minecraft, of course. You know?
Well, so the thing is, they've painted themselves into a corner as well, because the sensible thing for them to do would have been to boil the frog. The sensible thing for them to do would have been to just ride out another 4 years of Trump, and they could have just blocked him and played silly games, and he would have just fooled around on Twitter and what have you. That would have been the sensible thing for them if they'd been playing the long game. But they got greedy. They wanted too much too soon, and they've taken the mask off. It's really dumb, but the trouble is now that they can't just say, oh, well, actually, no, you are right, he did win. Because they would lose any shred of credibility that they still have. So they've really painted themselves into a corner. They're all in on this. They can't back out now.
China virus, very much the same.
That's the problem with politics now. It's all or nothing, and people they stake everything on these things because it's part of their entire worldview. It's so weird and it's so at odds with anything natural that they have to be all in every time, because the moment they even hesitate for anything, that's when the whole thing comes crashing down.
Well, there was a thing yesterday that I put on my Minds channel of what was it? I think it was I can't remember if it was a 94 or an 86-year-old old lady in UK, and her deal is every day she goes out and feeds the pigeons, and the police told her they were going to arrest her if she didn't stop feeding the pigeons because of the China virus. And she was sitting there with her face nappy on. How was she any, like, it's just it's bollocks, Excuse my language, it's just bollocks.
Of course. But yeah, as I said, we're in this. It's actually a very dangerous situation, because when you're dealing with people who are complete ideologues or sociopaths, and they can't back down, that makes them very dangerous as well.
Yeah.
And they must do anything and everything to maintain power and to maintain their narrative. They can't back off even an inch, because that will all come crashing down. It's like those Eastern European regimes in 1989.
Yeah.
The moment they wavered, that was it. It was over.
Yeah.
Just like that. Within hours, the whole thing was over.
Yeah, but it's worth pointing out they shot a few people, but basically they were all chucked out, killed, or destroyed very quickly.
Yeah.
And I think Globo Homo elite, in inverted commas, overlords are really in danger of that happening to them at the moment. And if it happens in America, which I think it could, thank God, and God bless America just for that, it could then spread to countries like UK and Australia. We can hope.
My only reason to be a little bit concerned is that perhaps in the chaos, China, for instance, could swoop in and sort of clean up in the chaos of all of that.
I don't know. I think if Australia, for example, has a good alliance with Japan and the UK, maybe South Korea, China, I think China would struggle against that in terms of not on the land campaign, but like no flat's going to be involved in a campaign against China. But I think if you're talking about ships and aircraft, I reckon China would struggle, because like Japan and Australia, and particularly if the UK comes in on their side, and maybe South Korea, maybe even India also these days.
Yeah, Vietnam as well.
Vietnam as well. I think China would struggle.
That's what I think we should be doing. I think we should be thinking, whichever way things go in the US, there's quite a high chance that it's going to be quite chaotic for some time, and the US may never. It may be well off its high watermark, and it may never get back to that point.
Might split it up. Yep.
And we therefore, it would be prudent for us to at least consider other arrangements. I think Australia should be pursuing some sort of other alliance.
I think you guys are in an alliance with Japan and South Korea. I think you're already in that. But yeah, I mean, like India and like
Vietnam,
I said,
Singapore.
Yeah, Vietnam. UK is opening its naval base in Singapore again. Like we've always had one there, but we're opening a new one. So yeah, absolutely. That's another reason I support Kanzuk. I'd like to see Kanzuk being like a naval force around the world.
Yeah, you'd know better than I do on that regard. Listen, having said that, I should probably get going.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say we're just coming up to 2 hours. I have put the link to your channel, your excellent channel, in the low bar from this stream. You got anything you want to shill, whatever, before you go?
No, I didn't. I don't really shill. Perhaps.
Strange. Yeah, I'm shilling too.
It's good. No, that's good though. That's good though.
Well, I'm about to shill, but yeah.
Okay.
All right, but really nice to have you on, man.
Thanks for having me on.
I'd love to have you on again in the future too.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no problem.
And I'd like to come on your channel at some stage.
Yes, yeah, sure. I'm always really bad at sort of organizing these things, but yeah, it's not because I don't want to have people on, and there are a whole lot of other people I want to have on as well. It's just that I never get around to organizing them.
Most interesting chat, man. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Very kind. Guys, I'm going to shell now. If you like my channel, please like and subscribe. That's the end of my showing. Have a good evening, guys. Thank you very much.